1937 and 1938 would prove to be eventful years for Reverend Brian Hessian. Having secured a seat as a member of the Cinema Christian Council, Brian immediately went to work. He was diligent and made sure he stayed current with all the literature the church published regarding film.
The main difficulty is there are very few religious films available. I am thinking of the attempts to set forth the Christian gospel to the masses of the people in this country.
But reaching the masses throughout the United Kingdom was exactly the vision that Reverend Brian Hessian had been evangelising for many years now. And the church's observation that there weren't many religious films available was just another challenge to be confronted and surmounted. In March 1937, at the meeting of the council in which Reverend Hessian was first introduced and made a council member, they held a discussion regarding potential films with sound moral religious themes that could be endorsed and broadcast by the church. One film in particular was raised as suitably meritorious but was dismissed as having been lost years ago, From the Manger to the Cross. This was a 1912 silent film directed by Sidney Alcott that depicted the life of Jesus Christ and at the time was immensely popular and critically acclaimed. It had not been presented in years and no surviving copies were known to exist. Reverend Hessian decided immediately that he would travel to the ends of the earth to locate this film if necessary. With some hard work and luck, the Reverend located R. Henderson Bland, the actor who had portrayed Jesus Christ in the 1912 movie. Bland knew the film was missing, but was convinced it could be found.
I told Reverend Hessian that I thought the film From the Manger to the Cross was still in existence, and that if one were on the spot in New York, it might be possible to trace its whereabouts.
And it was soon agreed that the two would travel to America, find From the Manger to the Cross, bring it back to England, and kick-start the British religious film movement. In preparation for the trip, Reverend Hessian made sure to maximise the public interest and anticipation for what he promised would be something truly special and unique, making headlines describing his secret mission. And with that dramatic parting announcement, Reverend Hessian prepared to sail to New York for the first time. He was on a quest, a treasure hunt. But before he could set off on his international trek, Reverend Hessian had to defend himself one more time, this time performing the Church of England Film Society without bothering to obtain permission from the Church of England to do so.
It's always very difficult to talk about something called the Church of England, because the Church of England is really an accumulation of organisations which achieve some sort of overall coherence. So there is actually, in many ways, an openness there, and at the same time a quality of vulnerability, because somebody like Archbishop Lang won't want the Church of England as a name to be taken in vain. And at the same time, it's still very difficult to be very clear about what it is. It's not a corporation in the obvious sense. So the question of moral and legal rights of possession and identity don't really apply. Everything in that sense is a negotiation to achieve a model of responsibility which actually works largely because it doesn't embarrass anybody. And this meant that a figure like Lang is going to look to certain established organisations as the embodiments of reliability and responsibility, and by the same token view somebody who tries to work outside them as being, well, just that, an outsider, somebody who might actually be not quite responsible and not quite predictable.
Again, T.H. Baxter, the council's secretary, notified Chaplain Don of this egregious breach of church etiquette.
The Executive Council were more than surprised at Hessian's move and wondered whether an individual priest could take on himself to form a Church of England organisation.
Don showed what some would consider substantial restraint when he communicated his displeasure at these developments.
While His Grace doubts whether he has any legal power to prevent individuals launching societies under the name of the Church of England, he thinks that it is scarcely appropriate that a society with that somewhat grandiloquent name should be inaugurated without any previous consultation with him or with the Cinema Christian Council.
It's not as though one's looking at an authoritarian organisation which has a very clear and applied sense of power over what is going on, but as a presence it's undoubtedly insistent, authoritative and ubiquitous.
Reverend Hessian was surprisingly aggressive in his responding tone to the chaplain, not being one to hesitate to confront or dispute authority, stating he felt that neither you nor His Grace could fully appreciate or understand the circumstances and workings of the Cinema Christian Council. Nevertheless, Reverend Hessian, perhaps having enough savvy not to cross this line formally, agreed to change the name of the society from the Church of England Film Society to the more generic Church Film Society. Having resolved that controversy for the moment, Hessian continued on his quest, sailing on the SS Laconia with Mr. Henderson Bland. Reverend Hessian and Mr. Henderson Bland reached America and immediately began their search. The first few days must have been eye-opening, with the busy city streets outpacing even the frenzy of London. It was the Reverend's first trip to New York, but it's unlikely that he spent much time sightseeing. Mr. Henderson Bland's American contacts appear to have been dead ends, people who'd disappeared years earlier. The international trip had been long and arduous, but it was not in Reverend Hessian's nature to retreat. He soldiered on and eventually found an acceptable copy of the film's negative. The purchase of the negative and the rights was funded partially by Reverend Hessian mortgaging his home and partially by a substantial cheque from a mysterious donor referred to in the press as Mr. X. Reverend Hessian's confidence in his mission was stronger than ever. Hessian immediately went to work. He added new scenes to the movie to modernise it, as well as his own commentary quoting strictly from the Bible. With his typical flair for publicity, Reverend Hessian made sure that his new project got plenty of press attention, perhaps too much attention. The Archbishop of Canterbury's deputy chaplain Alan Donn soon learned of the film and was lukewarm about endorsing the Reverend's work.
I confess to being a little doubtful about the Reverend Brian Hessian. He launched the Church Film Society in the first instance under the name of the Church of England Film Society, without any reference to the Cinema Christian Council. Hessian is undoubtedly a young man of enterprise and enthusiasm, but I am a little doubtful as to his discretion.
But none of this was enough to remove From the Manger to the Cross from public viewings, and Don seemed increasingly interested in doing just that. It was not long before he figured out a compelling way to try. A year earlier, Don had occasion to be an arbiter over the Church's potential censorship of two films, the French art film Golgotha and the American musical The Green Pastures. While the two films were presented in starkly different styles, there was one element they had in common. They both depicted the figure of God, albeit in radically different ways. Golgotha was in the more traditional style of movies and represented biblical figures as white and within the accepted realm of what these figures looked like. The Green Pastures, remarkably for its time, featured an all-African-American cast playing biblical figures, including God. The Church received complaints from a variety of corners about both films, some advocating for and some against the censorship of one or the other, or both. In November 1936, the Church decided to censor Golgotha and permit The Green Pastures, though for reasons that, from today's viewpoint, seem rather suspect.
His Grace thinks there is a real difference between the two films, in that one is a film which centres around a personal representation of our Lord himself, while the other simply represents a childlike conception of the deity, as pictured in the minds of a childlike people.
It's difficult now to miss the double standard in the censorship board's decision. Regardless of this unfortunate reality of the world's recent past, at the time Chaplain Don exploited the odd distinction to his favour, such that any broadcast of Reverend Hessian's reworked talkie version of From the Manger to the Cross would prove difficult, if not impossible. In December 1937, with the Archbishop of Canterbury's consent, Chaplain Don approved the request of the Cinema Church Council to form a viewing panel to advise as to possible films for support and approval by the Church. Almost immediately, Chaplain Don heard criticism from the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, who had sought the advice of a friend, Miss Rosamond Essex, the film expert on the Church Times staff and also a good friend of Chaplain Don. Miss Essex was not one to mince words.
As to the film From the Manger to the Cross, she pointed out that the photographs were about 20 years old. Good then, but not so good now, when talk and movement have to be combined. Miss Essex considered that by acceding to Hessian's request to boost this particular film, I would be doing something to help a film which was not first class, though fairly good.
Chaplain Don immediately forwarded on the Archbishop's thoughts to Reverend Hessian on the film.
After thinking carefully over the whole situation, His Grace has regretfully come to the conclusions that he cannot do what you request.
The Reverend immediately sent a very stern letter to Chaplain Don in response to the church declining to support From the Manger to the Cross. His words were angry and raw, reminding the church that it had approved the silent version of the film back in 1912, and therefore there was no reason for the church to withdraw its prior endorsement. The Archbishop immediately replied personally, and in words that can only be described as blunt.
I am very sorry, but I confess not wholly surprised that this difficulty has occurred. I thought you might be too confident in believing that as your film was passed as a silent film some years ago, there would be no need of any further passing, now that it has been transformed into a talking film. I am at present not satisfied as to the desirability of films being exhibited in public cinema halls, in which our Lord is personally represented.
Chaplain Don followed up with Reverend Hessian upon returning to the church the following day, reinforcing the church's position that the figure of Jesus Christ on film could not be supported by the church. He also stated that the church simply could not make an exception in this case, not only because it could lead to other exceptions, but to avoid the appearance of impropriety.
Obviously, His Grace would expose himself to a great deal of misunderstanding if it became known that he had connived at an exception being made in the case of a film owned by one of his own clergy.
Reverend Hessian continued to be relentless, writing to Don and claiming that his assistant Baxter was looking for a battle out of spite, but that Hessian and his supporters were ready to make as much dust as possible and attack either the CCC, the viewing panel, or Baxter. Alan Don tensely agreed to attend a viewing of the film at Fulham Palace, hosted by the Bishop of London, on the 12th of March 1938. The Fulham Palace showing of From the Manger to the Cross must have been quite a sight to behold. Alan Don did indeed attend the viewing, but perhaps most remarkably, Queen Mary herself was in attendance. This appearance would surely raise Reverend Hessian's profile enormously. Finally, Hessian was displaying his film to the very highest in British society, as he'd always believed was the appropriate place for such a showing.
Now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise. The angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, and the virgin's name was Mary. And behold, thou shalt bring forth a son, and shalt call his name Jesus. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger. Blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the wayside, begging. He began to cry out and say, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy upon me. And Jesus answered and said unto him, What wilt thou that I should do unto thee? The blind man said unto him, Lord, that I may receive my sight. Jesus said unto him, Go thy way, thy faith hath made thee whole. And they took Jesus and led him away, and he, bearing his cross, went forth. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Although Queen Mary declined the previous year to provide patronage to the Reverend Hessian, Her Majesty seemed interested in offering him her support. According to Reverend Hessian, Queen Mary was deeply impressed and gave her consent that her presence at the viewing could be made public.
Young man, you can make my presence known to the press and public if that will help you at all.
The fact that Queen Mary consented to see the film, but also, more importantly, consented to have it be known that she had seen the film and approved of it, I think is highly significant. And of course, like throughout this period, there's a slight unrespectability to cinema generally. And so the endorsement of a member of the royal family is absolutely a sort of guarantee that it's respectable.
Despite this public support, just a few days prior to the Fulham Palace viewing, Chaplain Alan Don began a letter campaign asking a variety of bishops what they thought of the idea of depicting the figure of Jesus Christ on film. The response was more or less unanimous: no. The viewing council released its pronouncement on From the Manger to the Cross.
The film, as a representation of the life of our Lord, is thoroughly unsatisfactory.
On this basis, the Entertainment Committee of the London County Council, or LCC, banned the film so that it could not be shown within the city. Chaplain Don invited a representative of the BBC to attend the 12th of March viewing and report back his review. Chaplain Don sought this expert through the BBC's Director of Religion, the Reverend Frederick Ironmonger. Reverend Ironmonger just happened to be the chaplain to the King, as well as a close friend of the Archbishop of Canterbury. There was little doubt that Ironmonger's opinion would be taken seriously, and according to the Reverend Ironmonger, the expert he assigned to watch the film was not impressed.
The whole thing struck him as being unworthy of any secular subject, still less of a religious one, and he thought that the taste of the whole thing was not above criticism.
Alan Don, as promised, also attended the film and wrote up 2 pages of notes, none of which were positive.
My impressions of the film may be stated thus. It is poor in quality, photography, and much below modern standards.
Graham Greene, while he worked as a film reviewer for The Spectator magazine, provided a lukewarm analysis, noting that the original footage was from 1912 and that 25 years in film history is like 5 centuries of painting. Greene found much in the film to be significant and relevant, particularly the suffering of Christ, comparing it, in 1938, to a Nazi prisoner in the Brown House. He saw the film as an unsentimental reminder of the material horror, the link between the raising of Lazarus and the monkey's paw. Unfortunately, Greene concludes that the only false notes are in fact the modern notes, added by Hessian.
There are 2 major differences that happen in that period. One is like a massive change in the ways in which films are edited. Like most films of the 1912 period tend to have an intertitle which describes what's going to happen in the scene, and then the shot is static, and the scene plays out in front of you. By the late 1920s, you have got an editing strategy where you have close-ups, the camera moves around, like somebody looks at something and the camera gives you a close-up of what they're looking at and then cuts back. So like a typical scene, instead of being shot in a single shot, is made up of a whole range of very short shots that dissect the space in film studies terms. That would have been as jarring for audiences in 1938 to see a film shot in the way that a film is shot in 1912 as the introduction of sound. It's a voiceover narration that the Manger of the Cross uses would have felt odd to audiences in 1938.
Despite this, Reverend Hessian did not give up. He was a man who knew how to do his research and studied the regulations closely, learning that the LCC only had jurisdiction over inflammable films. The Reverend simply had a non-inflammable copy of the film made, renting private cinemas for viewings. Moreover, there were reports arising in the newspapers that the bishops of Portsmouth, Winchester and Southampton were intending to see and support the film. But when the CCC's Secretary Baxter queried them, each denied they intended even to see it. Baxter reported this fact back to Alan Don, suggesting that the source of these misstatements should be attributed to Hessian. Don responded quickly, stating that if this were indeed the case, it would be reprehensible, and made a call to Baxter that we must stick to our guns. The very next day, T.H. Baxter of the council confronted Reverend Hessian about his tactics and reported back to Chaplain Don on the gist of the conversation.
Hessian and I had a regular set-to at the council meeting yesterday over this wretched film. Hessian tried to insinuate that all of the trouble was being caused by one person, namely myself. I was glad that the Bishop of Lichfield put the matter plainly by telling Hessian that he supposed that the crux of the matter was that the Cinema Christian Council thought the film was a bad one, while Hessian thought it was a good one.
The Bishop of Lichfield hit the nail on the head. Reverend Hessian was simply unable to see this movie as anything other than a good one. Indeed, while newspapers publicised the opinion of the council that the film ought not to be shown in public cinemas, this did not stop Reverend Hessian from displaying a statement as part of his showing of the film that the Archbishop of Canterbury approved the film. Hessian was again admonished by Don.
If this is true, the Archbishop feels bound to point out that it is a most misleading statement, and one which he hopes you will not repeat.
Chaplain Don and Baxter were becoming weary of Reverend Hessian and his tendency to make waves. The boycotting of his film then began in earnest. Indeed, even Buckinghamshire County Council, which presided over Reverend Hessian's own parish in Aylesbury, declined a request to show the film. Hessian went so far as to lease the Grotrian Hall, a run-down cinema that he redubbed the Religious Film Theatre. He began playing the movie non-stop, with occasional other religious films slotted in for balance. The Reverend Hessian asked the Archbishop for his blessing of the new theatre and the film. The Archbishop declined, and this time he did so personally.
Owing to the difficulties and complications which seem to be involved in this matter of religious films, I must not give it, to use your words, my blessings and approval.
In his typical fashion, Reverend Hessian continued to write to Chaplain Don and the Archbishop, reiterating his request for a meeting and a viewing, pleading with them to give his movie a chance. His tone is quixotic. But at the same time, the Archbishop was also hearing from the general public, who were not always enamoured with Brian's efforts.
In response to the letter from the Reverend Brian Hessian in the Times of October 10th, I took my daughter and a friend to the Grotrian Hall yesterday evening to see, as I thought, the passing of the third floor back. He mentioned that this was showing. As it turned out, that film is only to be seen on Sunday afternoon, and the only film showing was From the Manger to the Cross. The historic interest of this film is no doubt great, but to those accustomed to modern standards, the effect is naturally lamentable, and the whole tragically inadequate production, the uncomfortable seats, and generally amateurish element distressed me profoundly. There were 3 other persons in the theatre besides ourselves, and 2 of them went out before us.
By this point, the Archbishop had had enough of the tension between Reverend Hessian, Mr. Baxter and Chaplain Don.
His Grace does not feel disposed to do anything further in the matter of Hessian.
While Reverend Hessian continued to schedule additional viewings of the film where possible, darker and more ominous events were developing that would change everything for everybody. On September the 3rd, 1939, Reverend Hessian woke up, prepared himself in the normal course of business, and presided over his congregation in Aylesbury for communion, morning prayers and later evensong. It was all diligently recorded in the church register. In careful handwriting in the top right corner of the register page for that date, it was also unobtrusively noted that Germany is at war with Great Britain, Poland and France. Starting in September 1939, Reverend Hessian became a wartime vicar.
Well, I think he saw it very much as pointing them towards the Christian hope, pointing them towards eternal life rather than the current troubles. But Brian was also very, very good at looking after people who had personal grief, personal distress. So he'd be very much supportive of anyone who had lost a family member during the war, if they'd been killed on active service or if they died in a bombing raid, say in London. So Brian would have been very, very supportive and caring to anybody who had suffered as a direct result of the hostilities. It's a vicar's job anyway, but in the war he may have presided over more than he had expected to.
Yet Hessian remained a strong leader to his parish. His wife Molly served as an air raid precautions ambulance driver, while Brian himself served in the ARP control centre. There is record of only a single film produced by Reverend Hessian during the war. Let's Go Inside. With its dark and grim feel, it's an early, primitive example of film noir. It's a reflection on life in a wartime parish and depicts the only known surviving example of one of Reverend Hessian's filmed sermons.
Our lesson is taken from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? And your labour for that which satisfieth not. Seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. And let him return unto the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him. And to our God, for he will abundantly pardon.
The faces of the congregation are stern, sombre. The faces of those scarred by World War I. The faces of those who were losing loved ones in World War II. The faces of those who came back from battle a different person. Reverend Hessian tried to make the church a true place of refuge for the tired and the weary. Often the only choir available, a small luxury, a tiny escape from reality, was one heard on the radio or seen in one of Reverend Hessian's travelling film services.
Will you surrender yourself here and now to God? He will prove himself a power and a reality in your life. As we sing our last hymn, Abide With Me, may the words as we sing them be a prayer to God from the very bottom of our heart. Let us remain seated and sing.
Abide with me, fast falls the evening, the darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail, comforts flame, help of the helpless, so abide with me.
Hessian was part of a wonderful trajectory whereby he saw that films about religion were actually not all that good, and in many cases he thought, well, I'm going to make better films myself that fit with that particular vision. And in many respects I'd say he was quite a pioneer.
In 1944, just 2 years after Hessian's film was released, Archbishop William Temple appeared in a similar film, Message from Canterbury, with dark noir-like scenes, a congregation affected by the war, followed by a sing-along sermon with lyrics, a sermon from the Archbishop.
Live in the eternal glory of God's grace.
The influence of Hessian's style from 1942 on this film seems unmistakable. George Hollering, the director of Message from Canterbury, went on to produce and direct several films, including the feature-length film Murder in the Cathedral, a rendition of T.S. Eliot's verse drama portraying the death of Thomas Becket, which was encouraged by former Archbishop of Canterbury George Bell and supported by the church. Echoes of Brian's Let's Go Inside may be seen in this film as well.
No faith do I owe to a renegade, and what I owe shall now be paid.
Now to Almighty God, to the Blessed Mary ever Virgin, to the Blessed John the Baptist, the Holy Apostles Peter and Paul, to the Blessed Martyr Dennis, and to all the saints, I commend my cause and that of the Church.
Clear the air, clean the sky, wash the wind, take stone from stone and wash them. The land is foul.
Even though Hessian may have influenced the films that were increasingly finding support and praise from church experts, he remained unable to crack through the veneer of church credibility. But his work is considered more pioneering today, with some offering comparisons to Martin Scorsese.
I think Hessian and Scorsese are very similar in the way that they both came from a faith background, and filmmaking, or film production in the case of Hessian, but certainly in the case of Scorsese, film direction, they were very much driven by a faith. It may have been a lapsed faith in the case of Scorsese. Obviously, that wasn't the case with Hessian. But it was the drive, it was that which propelled their filmmaking proclivities. There was a sense of inner integrity which drove them on a particular journey, which may not have been to everyone's taste. Film. If Hessian was still alive in the 1980s, I suspect he would have been challenged by what Scorsese was doing, because Scorsese was doing something much more critical, something much more subversive, but within the boundaries of Christian theology.
He's also been compared to filmmaker Ed Wood, who perhaps favoured passion over technical perfection.
But like Ed Wood, the thing that he is a showman. You know, he's really good at using every single thing that is available to him to try and push that ambition.
In March of 1942, Archbishop of Canterbury Cosmo Lang resigned his position, and in April, William Temple was named his successor. Archbishop Temple inherited a difficult position. In the same month, Germany began its attacks on cathedral cities, known as the Baedeker raids, named after the German publisher of tour guides. The Luftwaffe vowed to bomb every building in Britain that the Baedeker Guide had awarded 3 stars. The attacks viciously focused on historic churches and cathedrals. In September 1942, the SS Laconia, the same ship that took Hessian to America in 1937, was torpedoed, having been converted to a military vessel. Hundreds died during the rescue mission following the strike after US bombers targeted U-boats that were assisting in the rescue. The incident purportedly contributed to the infamous order of German Naval Admiral Dönitz that no survivors of U-boat attacks be assisted. War was everywhere. Nevertheless, Hessian decided he had given enough time, 6 months, for Archbishop Temple to settle into his new position, and contacted him to seek an interview and endorsement of his movies. To Brian, religious films were critical to the morale of the people. In this tornado of war, Hessian resolutely made his case for Dawn Trust to receive the Archbishop's patronage, writing, "I know I am asking a lot, but I have high hopes for the future of the religious film movement." As was shown in his participation of the 1944 film Message from Canterbury, Archbishop Temple had some interest in film. The Archbishop forwarded the letter to the Bishop of Lichfield, who was one of the church's resident film experts and who had previously shown support for Hessian. 4 years on, though, the bishop's support had grown tepid. He gave his frank opinion about Hessian to Temple.
"I think I should advise you to go slow with this good man. He is full of fairly good ideas, but is rather the type of young man in a hurry, without any great wealth of wisdom. He has constantly badgered Cosmo about these things. He was always impatient with the Cinema Christian Council, of which he was a member, because the thought that we on that council were too slow and inefficient, and he has rather hived off and has always had schemes of his own."
He also recommended that the Archbishop seek further counsel from the current chairman of the CCC, Dr. Benjamin Gregory, who had similar thoughts on Hessian.
Hessian is enthusiastic and very hard-working, but is strongly individualistic and finds it very difficult to do teamwork.
Based on this, Temple respectfully declined to take up active association with Hessian's organisation. Hessian responded with 3 pages of reasons why the Archbishop was given mistaken advice regarding the proper utilisation of film for religious purposes. Temple forwarded this second letter again to the Bishop of Lichfield, saying that he did not want to be a wet blanket to an enthusiast, but continued to hesitate to support Hessian's company. The Bishop of Lichfield agreed and also suggested further input on the issue from a film expert, once again the Reverend Gilbert Shaw, who had been appointed to the CCC before Hessian and was increasingly being consulted on religious film issues by the Church, a role that Hessian dearly sought for himself. No doubt it would have annoyed Hessian to know that Gilbert Shaw was commenting on his work to the Archbishop, and the comments were not kind.
"I can only give the personal opinion which I think would be supported by Canon Barker and others, that Hessian's record in the past in regard to films is not good. We had great difficulty with him on various committees in which he would not work with anybody else, and he was responsible for putting on films which we did not consider either adequate or desirable as religious films.
Regardless of whether any of the criticisms were accurate or appropriate, they certainly resonated in the mind of Archbishop Temple.
It is certainly clear to me that I ought not to give my name in any way to the Dawn Trust.
On April the 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler killed himself in his Berlin bunker as Russian and US troops closed in on him. Just a few weeks later, the war was over. Reverend Hessian celebrated victory the only way he seemed to know how, by making a film. His Dawn Trust Productions released A Letter from Goathorn, a tour of Poole Harbour in Dorset, ostensibly in the form of a spoken letter to an injured soldier whose burnt and broken body would never be able to travel to that picturesque area. The entire movie was narrated by Hessian and is strikingly different in theme and mood from his dark 1942 movie Let's Go Inside.
My dear Stern, I've been to write to you for ages, to tell you about our holiday cottage and its romantic countryside. The harbour is studded with islands, whose yellow sandy beaches glisten invitingly in the sun. Poole Quayside, a sight to gladden the heart of any sailing man or small boy. Poole is a great centre for yachting people, and the variety of ships and boats lie as close today as did the ships of Drake and Raleigh on this very quay so long ago. And a reminder that once the men of Poole were so obstinate that King Charles paid a personal visit in an effort to win them over. He was not very successful. Perhaps he spent too long inside.
At this point, we passed our camera launch with my wife having trouble with the anchor in a fast-moving tide.
We too are soon to learn that it is a case of one hand for yourself and the other for the ship.
Even in this innocuous post-war travelogue film, the Reverend couldn't resist adding just a bit of harmless thrill.
The skipper decides to go about, and we change tack and make for the sheltered harbour before the wind gets worse. With the old water drifter in sight, we know that we are nearing Goathorn, where we're dropping our hook for the night. Here I must end my letter, and hope that one day you will come to Poole Harbour and enjoy a beauty that is for ever England.
As beautiful and calming as Poole was, it was not enough to contain Reverend Hessian's ambition. In 1946, he travelled to America for the second time, determined to find success for his religious films. And this time he didn't go to America empty-handed. This time he had a script of his own, The Hand That Drove the Nails, and 100 Reasons Why This Movie Should Be Hollywood's Next Big Thing. Adapted from a 1934 novel by J. Fletcher Ray, The Hand That Drove the Nails was well known at the time. The screenplay was another attempt by the Reverend Hessian to produce a big movie depicting the life of Jesus, but this time from a very different perspective, narrated by a vintage adventurer who happened upon a remarkable find. Hessian pictured Spencer Tracy playing the main character, or maybe a young Frank Sinatra, and he was determined to travel to America again and convince Hollywood that he was right, and this would be one fantastic film.
As a young man, I studied Aramaic at the university. I spent many hours in the school's old library, mastering the ancient tongue. Soon after completing my studies, the Great War arose and I was called to duty. I was shot on a rainy Italian night and was eventually sent to Rome to convalesce in a small inn. While there, the innkeeper offered me a casket of ancient documents. I was intrigued, and I paid a small pittance for the souvenir, but never bothered to open it. When I finally returned home and opened the casket, I was greeted by a pungent odor. Trembling with excitement, I removed the rolls and found, to my surprise, 3 huge nails, each long and red with rust. Reaching in again, I gasped with horror as I pulled out another object, the darkly stained bones of a man's hand. I read the parchment with a growing trepidation. Only when the dawn stole between the curtains did it fully occur to me. This was the confession of Scipio Marialis, none other than the executioner of Christ. This was the hand that drove the nails.
The exotic vicar filmmaker with his posh English accent, wise words and a script in his lap was just glamorous enough to pass Hollywood and New York muster. He was able to hobnob in the right circles, which included, among others, Roy Rogers, Robert Young, Douglas Fairbanks, and, in a friendship that would last Hessian's entire life, Mary Pickford. The American press seemed to pick up quickly on the Reverend and his dashing good looks. He wasn't quite on the front cover of Time magazine, but at least he was in it. Unlike his earlier expedition with Robert Bland Henderson to acquire a copy of From the Manger to the Cross, on this trip Reverend Hessian could observe and participate in 1940s Hollywood lifestyle. His relationship with the famed city was both romantic and scornful. In Hessian's words, "Hollywood is an atmosphere that gets into your blood when you've lived there and makes you want to go back, to the whirl of the fast-moving traffic, the heat, the crowded churches, and fantastic affairs with swimming pools. And above all, the friendly people, rich or poor. They are all hard workers and determined to enjoy life, even if so many make a mess of it. Success is the thing, as long as you are a success, and to be a success, you have to make a lot of noise." Hessian concluded, "Death does not enter into the picture at all, except perhaps in the form of suicide as a way out for some frustrated, disappointed failure." It's clear that Hessian's 5-month stay in Hollywood brought to him a feel of the town's soul. Maybe it was in all those crowded churches, maybe those fantastic affairs with swimming pools, maybe it was both. Hessian made connections and friends that would prove critical. He managed to secure a meeting in 1946 with the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who praised his work and even sent letters of recommendation to such notable financiers as Nelson Rockefeller and to celebrities such as Frank Sinatra. Mr. Rockefeller respectfully declined, relying on the advice of one of his associates, Martha Dalrymple, who did not find Reverend Hessian's project appealing, reasoning that it had all the makings of a Catholic-Protestant feud. Hessian also appeared on the radio, performing portions of his new film with famed English actress turned Hollywood starlet Anna Lee. Moreover, while in Hollywood, Bryan served as technical consultant on at least one movie, Jairus' Daughter, a religious tale produced by Cathedral Films. Hessian was on set with his trusty Argus Cintar camera on his hip, giving his input on Christian issues from a British perspective, to film producer and Cathedral Films founder James K. Friedrich. Though he found no significant investors for his production company Dawn Trust Films, his presence was enough to ruffle the feathers of some competitors. One organisation, the Protestant Film Commission from New York, wrote a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt after learning of one of her letters of recommendation. They wanted Mrs. Roosevelt to know that Reverend Hessian was not officially backed by the Church of England and proposed a meeting to introduce her to their own work. Mrs. Roosevelt scrawled a handwritten response to this letter. Its language would have surely pleased Reverend Hessian no end.
"I have your letter of October 29th. I liked Mr. Hessian and his ideas. I have only given him 1 or 2 recommendations. If he has had any success, I assure you it was on his own merits. I imagine there is room for more than one venture."
Hessian returned to England from the US with a reinvigorated fervour for his mission. Once his script sold, he hoped to return to the States, bringing his entire family with him, and planning to open a liaison office that would clear US films for UK distribution. It was time to live a new dream, perhaps the American dream. The script never sold. Still relentless, the Reverend worked hard to establish his name in the industry, writing articles and film criticisms that were published in well-respected trade periodicals such as Sight and Sound and Picture Goer. He was gaining credibility and produced work that is still taught in universities today.
I found that it was a very useful piece in which he was looking at the depiction in the United Kingdom of priests. Often they were portrayed as buffoons, Church of England country vicars. In America, he thought that particularly in a Roman Catholic context, there was a much richer sense of portrayal over priests. So his concern was that religion seemed to be putting people off, and he wanted to try and then make films which were serious films, good films, that weren't simply about, and he refers to the nonsense of films about angels in the afterlife.
Bryan also continued in his efforts to create a formal position within the church hierarchy for his film work. Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher, having replaced William Temple after his untimely death in 1944, would become the third Archbishop of Canterbury to have Hessians solicit their patronage. In typical fashion, Fisher penned his response in a deliberate manner and had no intention to address film on a piecemeal basis.
Quite apart from the fact that I am no particular judge of films, I am not prepared to involve myself in a position where I should have to give a judgment.
With the figure of Archbishop Fisher, we find ourselves moving into a very different landscape. Fisher is absolutely determined to face and to explore fully and efficiently what it is to have a Church of England in the context of the post-war world as a society that's readjusting, redeveloping, migrating often, and achieving new organisations, new government departments, new policies for a society that's capable of actually improving itself. He wants a church that is organised, efficient, responsive to society at large, is able to deal with anomalies and backward-looking traditions that may no longer serve. All of this might look very good to a figure like Brian Hessian, but at the same time, Fisher is someone who looks to organisational structures to give a clear definition and coherence to what's happening. And in that sense, Hessian is rather an outsider.
The church continued to be unreceptive to Hessian's ideas, and over the next 2 years the Reverend's cinematic aspirations would not only fail to materialise, his entire world was about to crumble. In 1948, Reverend Hessian's marriage ended.
Particularly that Christmas, there were arguments and tears, and I suppose it happens in many families. Doors got slammed, and I seem to remember that we departed from the vicarage with my father and mother a bit earlier than was planned. His wife, Molly, was leading a very active life and relationships of various kinds, and I don't know whether you want to know this, but I'm told that the local GP was involved in a personal relationship, and this led to a scandal in Aylesbury, and I think was part of the reason that he then moved from. I think he stayed on in Aylesbury for a bit, but didn't continue as the vicar. This is the time when divorce, particularly vicars heading for divorce, was, quite an unmentionable scandal, yeah.
As a result, Reverend Hessian was in a tough spot yet again. As a vicar in the Diocese of Oxford, Reverend Hessian would report to the Bishop of Oxford. In 1948, the Bishop of Oxford was Kenneth Escott Kirk, which raised substantial issues for Brian. Bishop Kirk literally wrote the book on marriage and divorce in 1933 and issued a new edition of that book that very year, 1948, setting forth his views of church doctrine on the issue of marriage and divorce. These views were complex. Traditionally, of course, divorce was a major taboo, strictly forbidden by the church. By 1948, however, even for vicars, the dissolution of a marriage became somewhat more acceptable, though tenuously so. In a 1948 correspondence with another bishop, Kirk offered encouragement to a student who wished to continue to seek his path to be ordained, even though he had been divorced, as long as the divorce was handled with discretion. Bishop Kirk also sharply warned that if the student ever decided to remarry, his employment with the church should not be expected to continue. He would also be expected to refrain from seeking communion should he remarry. With the end of Reverend Hessian's marriage a public scandal which could hardly be considered discreet, and as a young man who surely hoped to marry again, there seemed little future in the church for him. His choices were few.
Well, I think in the 1940s, Brian Hessian is still caught within a church and within a society too, which has certain understandings of what a parish priest is supposed to represent. And on the one hand, you have a very clear sense that someone who is set aside from society and is living a life that is irreproachable is not someone to be found in a state of divorce. On the other hand, you have a clear transition going on, because very few people can be under any illusions as to what is happening within the landscape at large as far as divorce, particularly after 1937 and so forth and so on. So there is a gradual and often painful adjustment going on, not only within the church but within society at large. So for a priest to be involved in divorce raises questions at that time. For many people, it's a question of pastoral effectiveness as well as actual principle. And I think this is something that will certainly have moved Brian Hessian further out as far as the institutions of the church were concerned. Because it has to be said that in the Church of England at large, there's often not very much moral courage where a main line of policy, one might almost say, is seen to be threatened. An individual is widely regarded as something more dispensable.
There were other things going on in the Reverend's life that played into the matter. Hessian continued to suffer what had been diagnosed as duodenal ulcers in the small intestine. He was required to take at least 2 leaves of absence during this period to recover, and the condition seemed to be worsening.
He was not better. In fact, he was worse. His pneumonia was followed by pains in the heart and a duodenal ulcer.
Additionally, Hessian's film company Dawn Trust was looking increasingly promising, with trade agreements being reached for US movies to be distributed in the UK. Hessian also planned to continue producing films of his own. Combined with his duties as a vicar and a broken marriage surrounded by public scandal, his life was growing quite difficult. In December 1949, Reverend Hessian announced he was resigning his post as Vicar of Holy Trinity, Walton, stating that he had contracted duodenal ulcers in the digestive tract, as a result of overwork. He intended to spend his time at his cottage in Poole, focusing on the work of Dawn Trust Films, producing religious films for a widening audience, after convalescing in Italy with his friend Filippo del Giudice. Filippo del Giudice was an Italian film producer who'd fled Mussolini's Italy to London in 1933 and is one of the more colourful characters that Reverend Hessian befriended during his roller coaster life. Del Giudice founded Two Cities Films with a philosophy of making better British movies, stating that he wanted to
give all the chances to the real talent. Let us fight for this ideal we shall enjoy much better than any money could ever offer, in pride and fun.
His philosophies seem to align well with those of Reverend Hessian. Del Giudice produced such well-known films as Hamlet and Henry V, starring Laurence Olivier, and which each won Oscars for Sir Lawrence. Nevertheless, the films were extremely expensive to produce, and Del Giudice was forced to sell a controlling interest to Arthur Rank. The Rank organisation soon clamped down on budgets and Del Giudice's creative freedom. He soon attempted to start a new production company and served as the administrator or presenter for a few movies. The financial challenges proved overwhelming. By the time Reverend Hessian joined his friend at his long-term residence at Italy's prestigious Excelsior Hotel in Rapallo, Del Giudice described himself as
broken, desperate, and exhausted.
The hotel was exquisite, and Del Giudice was receiving many glamorous visitors such as Ingrid Bergman, Roberto Rossellini, and Peter Ustinov. But Reverend Hessian did not stay long. The pains in his stomach were too severe to endure, and he returned early to London. Once back in London, Brian submitted his resignation to the church, which was accepted on the 20th of April 1950. Molly Hessian moved on. She married Stephen Henry Carnelli in 1952, a former Olympian runner who was educated and taught at Oxford University. Molly took her new husband's last name, and together they relocated to Naivasha, Kenya, where Stephen had a family home known as Hippo Point. Rumours of further adultery and drinking followed Molly into Kenya, but her family remembers her as a strong, independent woman who loved fast cars and fast horses. She was not afraid to pull out a rifle to scare away curious hippos that threatened her gardens. A woman described as someone who wore trousers and never skirts, and walked with a pronounced limp and cane that never slowed her down. It's clear that she was a woman determined to follow her dreams wherever they led her. In an odd twist, Molly Carnelli would later appear briefly in Africa Addio, a film directed by infamous Italian directors Gualtiero Jacopetti and Franco Prosperi. Along with the 1962 film Mondo Carne, Africa Addio was the foundation for the Mondo film movement, a series of shocking documentaries, later known as shockumentaries, filmed around the world. Africa Addio depicted the aftermath of the failed Mau Mau revolution in Kenya and the supposed crumbling of the British colonial structure there. Molly, her husband Stephen and their family are seen presiding over the auction of their family estate. According to her family, though, the filming was a staged mock-up choreographed by the directors, and the family has maintained Hippo Point up until the present day. As the weariness of the immediate post-war years drifted purposefully into the cautious optimism of the 1950s, life could not have been very easy for Reverend Hessian. He'd resigned his position at his beloved church and was back in the small coastal town of Poole, in the cottage which he'd shared with his now former wife and where he produced his 1946 film Letter from Goathorn. With his son in boarding school and his daughter having followed Molly to Kenya, Reverend Hessian was truly alone. It would have been easy for a man like Brian, no longer able to preside over a parish, to remove himself quietly into anonymity and solitude, to spend the rest of his days in the little coastal town preaching here and there. Or he could move to Hollywood and never return. Maybe his film script would sell one day. He'd wash away the past alone, hiding from the stigma, like so many other lost angels in a city filled with them. But the Reverend was not one to hide, and certainly not one to hide from the stigma or depression that can arise from solitude. Can we ever thank God for loneliness? The Reverend would ask later. I think we can, he concluded. Loneliness will never let us rest until we find a new life. It whispers voices that will lead us on to new achievements, new activities, new growth. All these new efforts to fill the void. Loneliness is not a byproduct, but a grief all to itself. It is a well to be filled very quickly with a kind of occupational therapy before we fall into it and drown. The Reverend certainly lived the way he preached. He immediately focused on working, entering into agreements with James Friedrich and his American company Cathedral Films to distribute American religious films in the UK. The Anglo-American trade agreement was in full effect, requiring high tariffs on US films distributed in the UK. Hessian, so passionate about religion and film, was showing himself to be an astute business person and did very well in negotiating the obstacles and bureaucracy required to pass muster under the agreement.
I think in that sense his move away from parochial life into the pursuit of a particular vocation was acceptable, though, across the church. That Hessian has moved into a particular area away from that broad pastoral work into something where he can continue without embarrassing either people or principles to pursue a real Christian vocation as a priest.
Soon Reverend Hessian found himself in love again, and in 1952 married Catherine Rowland Thomas. The two were married quietly. The couple held their small ceremony at St. Martin in the Bullring in Birmingham, presided over by Canon Brian Green, an old friend of Hessian's. Canon Green was one of the few clergymen at the time who would marry a divorced person with a spouse still living.
Canon Brian Green is one of the most remarkable and one of the most justly famous parish priests of the Church of England in this period of the 20th century. He's a pastoral priest of some authentic genius. I think there are two things to say, at least, about Brian Green and divorce. Firstly, that any such question would have been located firmly within his pastoral responsibilities as a priest and what he came to know for himself in the context of those relationships. The second thing is that he was really from an evangelical background, and the people who had the greatest difficulty with marriage in these particular contexts were more likely to be Anglo-Catholic or high church Christians, for whom marriage was holy and indissoluble and virtually a sacrament. The kind of Protestantism that Brian Green represented offered more room for manoeuvre, more room for compassionate pastoral understanding, and was in many ways essentially forward-looking.
The couple soon began preparations for a sea adventure to New York on the Queen Mary, followed by a road trip across America with a final destination of Los Angeles, where Brian had secured a job as technical producer for a new big-budget religious movie for Cathedral Films and his old friend James Friedrich. Day of Triumph was to tell the story of Jesus Christ in full technicolor and without any hesitation or qualms as to depicting the figure of Christ. It wasn't Hession's script and he wouldn't be directing, but technical producer was a step further up in the hierarchy than film distributor, and it was closer to the inner workings of Hollywood than he had ever been. The Hessians arrived in New York on May the 1st, 1954, after 11 days at sea. The couple acquired a new Chevrolet Bel Air and made the open road their home for a while, stopping at various churches to preach the message of Christianity through film, evangelizing religious film as a new and exciting way to reach congregations of a size not previously imagined. The trip took the couple across the landscape of America. They stopped in many different cities, finding places to preach, often without a fee, just room and board for a few nights. Travelling preacher and filmmaker was an occupation in which Brian took great pride.
Religious travelling showmen, they would go around and just set up shows, or you might have somebody like a Sunday school might book somebody who has a career. Their career is to go around various Sunday schools that have booked them and show their films. That tradition of travelling showmen comes really from the very early period. The very early film pioneers in the 1890s.
Brian and Catherine's final destination was Los Angeles, where Reverend Hession's work on Cathedral Film's Day of Triumph would soon begin. The pair arrived in Hollywood just in time for the beginning of shooting on the film, which the Reverend would bless with his technical production skills and understanding of British religious thought. He firmly believed the movie would be a huge success in both the US and the UK and cement his name as a pioneer of religious films, an ambition he'd spent over 20 years pursuing with a ferocious vigour. The Reverend spent 8 weeks on the set and worked without salary or expenses to ensure that would bring more spiritual integrity to the film in the name of the British churches. Reverend Hession was delighted with the movie and its producer, James Friedrich. Reverend Hession was also delighted to be working with director Irving Pichel, who he had previously hoped would direct his own film, The Hand That Drives the Nail. Only a few years earlier, Pichel had been placed on Hollywood's blacklist for alleged communist sympathies.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Hession must have had a great deal of empathy for Pichel, having had his own film, From the Manger to the Cross, banned by the church, something he never quite forgot. The blacklisting of Pichel did not seem to give Reverend Hession a moment's pause, anything to get a great movie made. By this time, the fear of stigma was old hat to the Reverend. This would be Pichel's final film, as he passed away from heart failure during production, still stigmatised, if not completely defeated, by his Hollywood blacklisting. He became another ghost floating around in Hession's universe. Day of Triumph fared modestly well with the critics and the public. By then, several big Christian movies had been made in Hollywood, with significantly larger budgets, giving Day of Triumph a distinct B-movie feel.
Well, this is Jesus Bar Joseph, the man from Nazareth. Oh? My brother, Simon Bar Jonas.
Simon?
And our friends, James and John Bar Zebedee.
You're the carpenter. No more. No longer will I labor with wood. Now my work is with mankind.
This new task you've undertaken, this work with men.
I bring them hope, new hope. For the kingdom of God is close at hand, and his forgiveness ready for all who repent and truly believe.
Moreover, much of the Hollywood gloss that Reverend Hession hoped to strip away from the story of Jesus seemed firmly in place, and the genre was later parodied by Mel Brooks in his classic satire, History of the World.
Stop. Could you please step on the same foot at the same time? My tits are falling off!
Although it's a truly heartfelt piece of work, Day of Triumph faded into relative obscurity, a Christian cult classic. But in Hession's eyes at the time, it was a step closer to his dreams of spreading his gospel through film. But soon enough, his film resume would be the last thing on Hession's mind.